Hello. So this is the history of Massachusetts, I think fourth video in the research series where I look at whatever I want to. Hat's coming on for this one because why not? So let's get right into it. So today we're going to be covering the history of Massachusetts starting from the first settlement in 1620 all the way up until after the American Revolutionary War. The history afterwards for Massachusetts can basically be embodied by the entire American development because a lot of events, history, political parties, things were centered and founded in Massachusetts. In later videos, we'll cover a lot of history, and Massachusetts will be brought up again a lot. Getting right into it though, the first settlement, I have my notes here just because I don't know everything by heart. Just kind of researched this randomly. But the first settlement of Massachusetts was by the Pilgrims in 1620, where they were fleeing religious persecution because the Pilgrims were Protestants, and they believed in a religious life focusing purely around the Bible, where the current state of religion in England was the Church of England, where they were following closely on the Catholic Church, which was more of like, I think, at least in my opinion, they believed that the English church was too focused on having the church almost be like a business, and it wasn't really focused on the religion itself. And so that's why they saw it as anti whatever they wanted in terms of religious, what they wanted to get out of religion. So that aside, they started their own private charter. It was 100 individuals, 100 pilgrims on the Mayflower, which I think almost everyone has heard in their history classes. And so they sailed to America in 1620, I think on a 66-day voyage, the devil number. And as they arrived, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was one of the first forms of self-governance in America. They were the second settlement or second colony to ever land in America right after Jamestown in Virginia, which I think happened in 1607 or 1606, one of those 2 years. But they founded the Plymouth Colony, named after Plymouth, England, where they were from. But this is not to get confused with the Plymouth Company, which was the chartered company from one of the kings to expand economic development and merchants and trading routes for the British throughout New England. Two different things. And they first settled in Maine, like we talked about in the previous video, but it only lasted a year. So they founded the Plymouth Colony, which is different. So that's kind of a little bit about the history of the Pilgrims landing. And so their first year in 1620 was brutal. The weather conditions were terrible, and they lost half of all of their people within the first year. And the main reason for their survival was their connection and friendship with the Wampanoag people, Native Americans. Hopefully I don't get flagged for mispronouncing that, but the Native American tribe that helped them survive because they had a complete understanding of the land. They'd been there for hundreds of years. So that friendship allowed them to survive as the Native Americans helped them throughout the cold temperatures and through the, I guess, brutal season. And then in 1621, we had the first ever Thanksgiving, where the half of the Puritans, or half of the Pilgrims that still survived, thanked God for surviving and through making it through the brutal weather, and for a good harvest that spring and summer season. And because of that, they also invited the Wampanoag people, and kind of led to this congregation of, friends and Thanksgiving, where you come together and celebrate just being alive. A very nice tradition that started in 1621 by the Pilgrims. Moving on. Now, just quickly, one more thing. The Pilgrims also, after that, grew very slowly. They only ever reached, or I think in the next 10 years, they only expanded to 300 people. So they arrived with 100. After 1 year, became 50, and then over the next 10 years, only became 300. So they were very slowly growing. At the same time, in 1628, the Puritans arrived also in Massachusetts, and they started their own Massachusetts, colony. that's kind of when the real Massachusetts colony became a significant chunk of land in America, where they landed in Salem and Boston, these two regions. So the Puritans themselves were also very similar religiously to the Pilgrims. They had a religious belief of they were also Protestants. They also were religiously prosecuted by the Church of England and were seeking religious freedom in the New World. But they had a much more popular religion and popular, I guess, I don't know, they were, I guess, more enticing to settle with, because over the next 10 years they had over 20,000 immigrants settle within Salem and Boston, which propelled them far faster economically than the Plymouth colony, who was kind of dwindling. And that was kind of a main reason why the Puritans became the prominent settlers in Massachusetts. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. Now, one more thing. There was a lot of small events that happened throughout Massachusetts. I mean, you had like Salem witch trials, or like a lot of random things. But one quick thing that also happened was there were also a lot of religious disagreements, or settlers wanted to just go find their own colonies. And so you also had the likes of Robert Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who had major religious disagreements with the Puritan leaders in Massachusetts, or within Boston, I think, where they were located. And so they went off to go start their own settlements and colonies. And Robert Williams and Anne Hutchinson eventually came together and started Rhode Island. Cool fact. And then you also have Connecticut, which was also settlers not dissenting, but leaving Massachusetts to go start their own colonies. Yeah, moving on. So, over the years, Massachusetts became a powerhouse for global trade, for merchants, and for production, given their coastline, their port placement, and overall the influx of immigrants to the area, which stimulated the economy and really just had a lot of demand for things and allowed them to grow their revenues, because you have more people who could spend more money. So as a colony, Massachusetts was growing, and Boston specifically was becoming a major hub for trade. And because of that, Britain wanted to put their hands in the pockets of the Bostons, or of the Massachusetts colonists. And so they started implementing more taxes. They then also implemented the Navigation Acts, or the Navigation Acts, which was again Britain just trying to put their hands in the pockets of the colonists. And what the Navigation Act did was it regulated the amount of production and trade, and where these colonists could trade, and what trade routes were allowed for them, and seemed to prioritize the British ships over these colonist ships, which enraged a lot of the Americans, to the point where there was some form of a lot of illegal smuggling going on. And the British quickly caught wind of this and became even more infuriated. And at the time also, the English were starting to realize how profitable overall merchants were from the colonies. And so they decided to say, hey, you know what? A lot of you guys came over on private charters, and some of you came over on royal charters, but overall we still see you as British people. So in 1684, they decided to take control of all of New England, and claimed it as their own. And they then established the Dominion of New England, which centralized the English control over this area, and allowed for them to basically have full control, setting their own governors and political. Let's see, they had a different political system. It wasn't exactly a parliament in the U.S., but they had their own governors go and take control of the area of New England. This greatly enraged the colonists. This seems to be a common theme of the British just trying to tax and control, while the English, or the settlers, left England for a reason, which was to get away, to get their own land. Now, the most important figure for, in terms of governors of the Dominion of New England, was Sir Edmund Andros, who became the governor of New England, I think around 1966. I don't have the number exactly. But he was probably the most unpopular governor of all time. He did not allow for any form of general assembly. He didn't have he didn't even have a representative assembly of local colonists who could speak on behalf of the colonies. He just did what he thought was best for himself and for the British people. He also was trying to challenge the land rights of the individuals of New England. And this was probably the greatest threat and what scared the most amount of colonists, because at the time, land rights were the prime source of, the prime source of freedom, liberty. It showed status. It's what gave people that feeling that they were no longer part of England, that they were their own independent bodies and could make their own choices. They had freedom. That's essentially it. And so, contesting that, Sir Edmund Andros was trying to take away the land titles of New Englanders and make it under British rule, because in England, no one even had their own land titles. So this made him widely unpopular. And as you could expect, he was overthrown in 1689, him and all of his officials, and this happened simultaneously while King James was overthrown by William III and Mary II. Probably not going to remember that, but it's good to know that simultaneously as there was an overthrow of the British monarchy, there was also an overthrow in the Americas. So I guess they let this slide for a while, and they let the U.S. or the colonies self-govern themselves for a long time, up until 1773. With the introduction of the Tea Act is kind of when everything kind of went off the rails. So there had been a growing movement called patriotism, where the American colonists kind of wanted to have their own independent nation away from England and from the UK, or from Britain. And that formed somewhat of a divide between what is now known as like the Loyalists, which were loyal to Britain or the English crown, and the Patriots, who were hoping to become an independent nation. And then in 1773, we had the Tea Act, which was a tax that made it cheaper to purchase tea from the British East India Company compared to purchasing it from just the illegally smuggled tea or the cheap tea from the colonist merchants. And this was really bad because it undercut the profit of all of the colonist merchants and enraged a lot of people living within Boston and the Massachusetts area, because it was a detriment to their economical growth. If the major merchants weren't able to supply and continue to grow the economy by putting in money because they weren't making as much, it led to the sinking or the lowering of everybody's ship, or at least all the colonist ships. And so this led to more outrage by the public, but specifically by a specific group known as the Sons of Liberty. And they were constantly attacking or finding ways to inhibit and to slow down and to reduce the amount of sales of the British East India Company. And because of this, they also, while they were doing that, simultaneously, they also had this one big act, which we now know as the Boston Tea Party, where they dressed up as Native Americans and dumped over thousands of pounds of tea from the British East India Company, which lost them, I think, several $100,000 or maybe millions of dollars for the company. I don't know. I'm making that up. I take that back. I can't say that for sure. But that was a huge no-no from the British Parliament, who gave the colony of Massachusetts and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which still include Maine, a large slap on the wrist and said, you guys are kind of screwed. And so they punished them with the Intolerable Acts. I'm just going to switch this around a little bit. And the Intolerable Acts basically closed the port of Boston for not for good, but for the time being. And it also took away any form of self governance that the people of Massachusetts had. And they finally stationed troops all throughout Boston and throughout the greater Massachusetts area so that they constantly had stationed troops to control and to make sure there was no dissent by the colonists. And this was a huge topic throughout the 13 colonies, with a lot of the 12 other colonies sympathizing for the treatment of Massachusetts. And simultaneously, the Sons of Liberty and other forms of patriots formed the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, so that they could continue to have a form of self governance, even while they were technically being controlled by someone else or by British rule. And when the British got wind of this, the British Parliament then also declared that Massachusetts was in a state of rebellion and sent even more troops. And this is what slowly led to the American Revolution. Now, the time period is 1775. We have just had the Tea Party 2 years ago, stationed troops throughout 1774. And it's the beginning of 1775 where the rebellion has been declared in Massachusetts, and the British are slowly scared of a revolution within their colonies. And so they go to Massachusetts, send more troops in hopes to find, backtrack. They have all the troops stationed in Boston, Massachusetts, and they find out that there are a huge group of revolutionists or patriots who are trying to start a rebellion. And so they, on April 18th, 1775, decide that they're going to march to, I think it's Concord. Yeah, so on 1775, April 18th, they decide that they're going to march to Concord to destroy the armory and any form of military weapons that the Patriots have. They decided to march on that next day. And so then on the midnight of April 18th, 1775, we have the Paul Revere Midnight Ride, where he goes and warns all of the Minutemen along his way to Concord and within Concord, meaning the next morning when the British military arrives, they are quickly thwarted and are sent back to the city, where they declare then the city under siege as the American military starts to form. George Washington then becomes the military general, and Henry Knox becomes the head of artillery, because while he was never in war or battle, he did have a bookstore where he read a lot of artillery facts, and he knew a lot about how to strategize with heavy artillery. So that's a cool fact. Henry Knox, that guy. Another cool, interesting fact: at that exact time, while the British were under siege, they sent people with smallpox into the colonist settlements, or the patriotic settlements, the Continental Army, if you want to call them that. I don't know if they were there at the time they were called the Continental Army yet, but they sent people with smallpox into these settlements so that they would get infected, and it was an early form of biological warfare. But this was quickly stopped by George Washington, who started what's the word? He started some form of vaccination program. And through the vaccination program, everybody quickly healed, leading to the next stages of the siege of Boston, which is the cool part where Henry Knox, now I'm going to need to look up these names because I don't know exactly, but there was a strategic placement of artillery where Henry Knox laid these heavy cannons, so very, very heavy artillery that could take out ships, that could take out whole buildings, and placed them on Fort Ticonderoga. I look probably, whatever. That's how it's sounding. Ticonderoga. I've heard of that before. Anyways, Ticonderoga. He places them on multiple high vantage points, also one that has a direct view onto all of the British military ships and British ships in general over Boston. And so the Boston British individuals are forced to flee because they know that if these people fire these heavy artillery, they will be absolutely obliterated. And so that leads to the British to flee in the first major American victory in the American Revolutionary War by George Washington and his troops, and is celebrated throughout. But this is also the first real war and attack, and starts to the 8-year-long war of the Revolution. And that's kind of like the major history I have behind Massachusetts. I could go, like I said earlier, in much more depth into all of the future developments, which I will, but in a different video, because this is focusing mostly on Massachusetts, and the rest of the developments are kind of nationwide. So, but next kind of major point was on July 4th, 1776, where we support the 4th of July, or the Independence Day. That was the day where all of the colonies unanimously signed the Declaration of Independence. John Adams was a very important figure for getting all of these colonies to sign it. And it was first signed by John Hancock, who became the first governor of the state of Massachusetts, and proudly read aloud to his Boston citizens upon a balcony. And he says, "Today, you are no longer a colony, but a free state of a new nation, the United States of America." I can only imagine the uproar and applause and the blithe of all of the people in the crowd. Blithe meaning blissful joy. Nice. Now I could continue, blah, blah, blah. Another interesting fact is Harvard. Center of Education is very prominent in Massachusetts. So we have the first ever university, Harvard University, one of the best Ivy League schools in America, being founded in 1636, and later renamed Harvard for John Harvard, who was the first funder or backer of the institution. He was a Puritan. And the school originally was for teaching clergymen, to give them an education. And yeah, it's an interesting fact. It's located in Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts. Additionally, I assume everyone knows that Boston is the capital of Massachusetts. It has a population of around 675,000. And yeah, one more interesting thing was the Salem witch trials, which took place from 1692 to 1693, which was this huge craze about that there were witches performing witchcraft and healing people. So a lot of apothecaries, which were kind of like medicinal doctors using more traditional herbs and roots and spices to heal people, and traditional practices were kind of portrayed and declared to be witches. And then at the time, 1692, around 300 people were accused of being witches, 30 of which were found guilty, and 19 of which were hanged. And it was kind of a crazy time, because people, if you were accused of being a witch, you had two options. You were either guilty, or you could accuse someone else. So that's the kind of judicial system that they lived under back then. But other than that, true, one more thing, the battles of Lexington and Concord were the first rebel battles, or the first real battles of the American Revolutionary War, which is what we talked about, where Paul Revere had his midnight ride. The next day, there were battles in Lexington, I think, where the people were overrun by the British Army, and then in Concord, where the Minutemen were able to repel the forces back to Boston. Those were the first battles of the war. Other than that, thank you for listening. If you are listening, good stuff. I'll see you guys in the next one.